War and Peace, Book 8, Chapter 15. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. On returning late in the evening, Sonia went to Natasha's room and to her surprise found her still dressed and asleep on the sofa. Open on the table beside her lay Anatole's letter. Sonia picked it up and read it. As she read, she glanced at the sleeping Natasha, trying to find in her face an explanation of what she was reading, but did not find it. Her face was calm, gentle, and happy. Clutching her breast to keep herself from choking, Sonia, pale and trembling with fear and agitation, sat down in an armchair and burst into tears. How was it I noticed nothing? How could it go so far? Can she have left off loving Prince Andrew? And how could she let Kurágin go to such lengths? He is a deceiver and a villain, that is plain. What will Nicholas, dear noble Nicholas, do when he hears of it? So this is the meaning of her excited, resolute, unnatural look the day before yesterday, and today, thought Sonia. But it can't be that she loves him. She probably opened the letter without knowing who it was from. Probably she is offended by it. She could not do such a thing. Sonia wiped away her tears and went up to Natasha, again scanning her face. "Natasha," she said just audibly. Natasha awoke and saw Sonia. "Oh, you are back!" And with the decision and tenderness that often come at the moment of awakening, she embraced her friend, but, noticing Sonia's look of embarrassment, her own face expressed confusion and suspicion. "Sonia, you have read that letter?" she demanded. "Yes," answered Sonia softly. Natasha smiled rapturously. "No, Sonia, I can't any longer," she said. "I can't hide it from you any longer. You know, we love one another. Sonia, darling, he writes. Sonia." Sonia stared open-eyed at Natasha, unable to believe her ears. "And Bolkonsky?" she asked. "Oh, Sonia, if you only knew how happy I am!" cried Natasha. "You don't know what love is." "But Natasha, can that be all over?" Natasha looked at Sonia with wide open eyes as if she could not grasp the question. "Well then, are you refusing Prince Andrew?" said Sonia. "Oh, you don't understand anything. Don't talk nonsense. Just listen," said Natasha with momentary vexation. "But I can't believe it," insisted Sonia. "I don't understand. How is it you have loved a man for a whole year and suddenly... Why, you have only seen him 3 times. Natasha, I don't believe you. You are joking. In 3 days to forget everything and so..." "3 days?" said Natasha. "It seems to me I have loved him 100 years. It seems to me that I have never loved anyone before. You can't understand it. Sonia, wait a bit. Sit here," and Natasha embraced and kissed her. "I had heard that it happens like this, and you must have heard it too. But it is only now that I feel such love. It is not the same as before. As soon as I saw him, I felt he was my master and I his slave, that I could not help loving him. Yes, his slave. Whatever he orders I shall do. You don't understand that. What can I do? What can I do, Sonia?" cried Natasha with a happy yet frightened expression. "But think what you are doing," cried Sónya. "I can't leave it like this. This secret correspondence. How could you let him go so far?" she went on with a horror and disgust she could hardly conceal. "I told you that I have no will," Natásha replied. "Why can't you understand? I love him." "Then I won't let it come to that. I shall tell," cried Sónya, bursting into tears. "What do you mean, for God's sake? If you tell, you are my enemy," declared Natásha. "You want me to be miserable? You want us to be separated?" When she saw Natásha's fright, Sónya shed tears of shame and pity for her friend. "But what has happened between you?" she asked. "What has he said to you? Why doesn't he come to the house?" Natásha did not answer her questions. "For God's sake, Sónya, don't tell anyone, don't torture me," Natásha entreated. "Remember, no one ought to interfere in such matters. I have confided in you." "But why this secrecy? Why doesn't he come to the house?" asked Sónya. "Why doesn't he openly ask for your hand? You know Prince Andrew gave you complete freedom. If it is really so, but I don't believe it. Natásha, have you considered what these secret reasons can be?" Natásha looked at Sónya with astonishment. Evidently this question presented itself to her mind for the first time, and she did not know how to answer it. "I don't know what the reasons are, but there must be reasons." Sónya sighed and shook her head incredulously. "If there were reasons..." she began. But Natásha, guessing her doubts, interrupted her in alarm. "Sónya, one can't doubt him, one can't, one can't! Don't you understand?" she cried. "Does he love you?" "Does he love me?" Natásha repeated with a smile of pity at her friend's lack of comprehension. "Why, you have read his letter and you have seen him." "But if he is dishonorable? He dishonorable! If you only knew!" exclaimed Natásha. "If he is an honorable man, he should either declare his intentions or cease seeing you. And if you won't do this, I will. I will write to him and I will tell Papa," said Sónya resolutely. "But I can't live without him!" cried Natásha. "Natásha, I don't understand you. And what are you saying? Think of your father and of Nicholas." "I don't want anyone. I don't love anyone but him. How dare you say he's dishonorable? Don't you know that I love him?" screamed Natásha. "Go away, Sónya. I don't want to quarrel with you. But go, for God's sake, go!" "You see how I am suffering!" Natásha cried angrily, in a voice of despair and repressed irritation. Sónya burst into sobs and ran from the room. Natásha went to the table and without a moment's reflection wrote that answer to Princess Mary which she had been unable to write all the morning. In this letter she said briefly that all their misunderstandings were at an end, that availing herself of the magnanimity of Prince Andrew, who, when he went abroad, had given her her freedom, she begged Princess Mary to forget everything and forgive her if she had been to blame toward her, but that she could not be his wife. At that moment this all seemed quite easy, simple, and clear to Natásha. On Friday the Rostovs were to return to the country, but on Wednesday the count went with the prospective purchaser to his estate near Moscow. On the day the count left, Sónya and Natasha were invited to a big dinner party at the Karagins', and Maria Dmitrievna took them there. At that party Natasha again met Anatole, and Sónya noticed that she spoke to him, trying not to be overheard, and that all through dinner she was more agitated than ever. When they got home, Natasha was the first to begin the explanation Sónya expected. "There, Sónya, you were talking all sorts of nonsense about him," Natasha began in a mild voice such as children use when they wish to be praised. "We have had an explanation today." "Well, what happened? What did he say?" "Natasha, how glad I am you are not angry with me. Tell me everything, the whole truth. What did he say?" Natasha became thoughtful. "Oh, Sónya, if you knew him as I do. He asked me what I had promised Bolkónski. He was glad I was free to refuse him." Sónya sighed sorrowfully. "But you haven't refused Bolkónski," said she. "Perhaps I have. Perhaps all is over between me and Bolkónski. Why do you think so badly of me?" "I don't think anything, only I don't understand this." "Wait a bit, Sónya. You will understand everything. You will see what a man he is. Now don't think badly of me or of him. I don't think badly of anyone. I love and pity everybody. But what am I to do?" Sónya did not succumb to the tender tone Natásha used toward her. The more emotional and ingratiating the expression of Natásha's face became, the more serious and stern grew Sónya's. "Natásha," said she, "you asked me not to speak to you, and I haven't spoken. But now you yourself have begun. I don't trust him, Natásha. Why this secrecy?" "Again, again!" interrupted Natásha. "Natásha, I am afraid for you." "Afraid of what?" "I am afraid you are going to your ruin," said Sónya resolutely, and was herself horrified at what she had said. Anger again showed in Natásha's face. "And I will go to my ruin, I will, as soon as possible. It is not your business. It won't be you, but I who will suffer. Leave me alone, leave me alone. I hate you." "Natásha," moaned Sónya aghast. "I hate you, I hate you. You are my enemy forever." And Natásha ran out of the room. Natásha did not speak to Sónya again and avoided her. With the same expression of agitated surprise and guilt, she went about the house, taking up now one occupation, now another, and at once abandoning them. Hard as it was for Sónya, she watched her friend and did not let her out of her sight. The day before the count was to return, Sónya noticed that Natásha sat by the drawing-room window all the morning as if expecting something, and that she made a sign to an officer who drove past, whom Sónya took to be Anatole. Sónya began watching her friend still more attentively and noticed that at dinner and all that evening Natásha was in a strange and unnatural state. She answered questions at random, began sentences she did not finish, and laughed at everything. After tea Sónya noticed a housemaid at Natásha's door, timidly waiting to let her pass. She let the girl go in, and then, listening at the door, learned that another letter had been delivered. Then suddenly it became clear to Sónya that Natásha had some dreadful plan for that evening. Sónya knocked at her door. Natásha did not let her in. "She will run away with him," thought Sónya. "She is capable of anything." There was something particularly pathetic and resolute in her face today. She cried as she said goodbye to Uncle, Sónya remembered. Yes, that is it. She means to elope with him, but what am I to do? Thought she, recalling all the signs that clearly indicated that Natásha had some terrible intention. The count is away. What am I to do? Write to Kurágin demanding an explanation? But what is there to oblige him to reply? Write to Pierre, as Prince Andrew asked me to, in case of some misfortune? But perhaps she really has already refused Bolkónski. She sent a letter to Princess Mary yesterday. And Uncle is away. To tell Maria Dmitrievna, who had such faith in Natásha, seemed to Sónya terrible. Well, anyway, thought Sónya, as she stood in the dark passage, now or never I must prove that I remember the family's goodness to me and that I love Nicholas. Yes, if I don't sleep for 3 nights, I will not leave this passage, and will hold her back by force and will, and not let the family be disgraced, thought she. End of chapter 15. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 8, Chapter 16. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Anatole had lately moved to Dólokhov's. The plan for Natalie Rostóva's abduction had been arranged and the preparation made by Dólokhov a few days before, and on the day that Sónya, after listening at Natásha's door, resolved to safeguard her, it was to have been put into execution. Natásha had promised to come out to Kurágin at the back porch at 10 that evening. Kurágin was to put her into a troika he would have ready and to drive her 40 miles to the village of Kamenka, where an unfrocked priest was in readiness to perform a marriage ceremony over them. At Kamenka, a relay of horses was to wait, which would take them to the Warsaw highroad, and from there they would hasten abroad with post horses. Anatole had a passport, an order for post horses, 10,000 rubles he had taken from his sister, and another 10,000 borrowed with Dólokhov's help. 2 witnesses for the mock marriage, Kvostikov, a retired petty official whom Dólokhov made use of in his gambling transactions, and Makarin, a retired hussar, a kindly, weak fellow who had an unbounded affection for Kurágin, were sitting at tea in Dólokhov's front room. In his large study, the walls of which were hung to the ceiling with Persian rugs, bearskins, and weapons, sat Dólokhov in a traveling cloak and high boots at an open desk on which lay abacus and some bundles of paper money. Anatole, with uniform unbuttoned, walked to and fro from the room where the witnesses were sitting, through the study to the room behind, where his French valet and others were packing the last of his things. Dólokhov was counting the money and noting something down. "Well," he said, "Kvostikov must have 2,000. "Give it to him then," said Anatole. Makarka, their name for Makarin, will go through fire and water for you for nothing. So here are our accounts all settled, said Dólokhov, showing him the memorandum. Is that right? Yes, of course, returned Anatole, evidently not listening to Dólokhov and looking straight before him with a smile that did not leave his face. Dólokhov banged down the lid of his desk and turned to Anatole with an ironic smile. Do you know, you had really better drop it all. There is still time. Fool, retorted Anatole, don't talk nonsense. If you only knew. It is the devil knows what. No, really, give it up, said Dólokhov. I am speaking seriously. It is no joke, this plot you have hatched. What, teasing again? Go to the devil, eh? Said Anatole, making a grimace. Really, it is no time for your stupid jokes, and he left the room. Dólokhov smiled contemptuously and condescendingly when Anatole had gone out. You wait a bit, he called after him. I am not joking. I am talking sense. Come here, come here. Anatole returned and looked at Dólokhov, trying to give him his attention and evidently submitting to him involuntarily. Now listen to me. I am telling you this for the last time. Why should I joke about it? Did I hinder you? Who arranged everything for you? Who found the priest and got the passport? Who raised the money? I did it all. Well, thank you for it. Do you think I am not grateful? And Anatole sighed and embraced Dólokhov. I helped you, but all the same, I must tell you the truth. It is a dangerous business, and if you think about it, a stupid business. Well, you will carry her off, all right. Will they let it stop at that? It will come out that you are already married. Why, they will have you in the criminal court. Oh, nonsense, nonsense, Anatole ejaculated and again made a grimace. Didn't I explain to you? What? And Anatole, with the partially dull-witted people have, for any conclusion they have reached by their own reasoning, repeated the argument he had already put to Dólokhov 100 times. Didn't I explain to you that I have come to this conclusion? If this marriage is invalid, he went on crooking one finger, then I have nothing to answer for. But if it is valid, no matter. Abroad, no one will know anything about it. Isn't that so? And don't talk to me. Don't. Seriously, you had better drop it. You will only get yourself into a mess. Go to the devil, cried Anatole, and clutching his hair left the room, but returned at once and dropped into an armchair in front of Dólokhov with his feet turned under him. It is the very devil. What? Feel how it beats. He took Dólokhov's hand and put it on his heart. What a foot, my dear fellow! What a glance! A goddess! He added in French. What? Dólokhov, with a cold smile and a gleam in his handsome, insolent eyes, looked at him, evidently wishing to get some more amusement out of him. Well, and when the money is gone, what then? What then, eh? Repeated Anatole, sincerely perplexed by a thought of the future. What then? Then, I don't know. But why talk nonsense? He glanced at his watch. It is time. Anatole went into the back room. Now then, nearly ready? You are dawdling, he shouted to the servants. Dólokhov put away the money, called a footman, whom he ordered to bring something for them to eat and drink before the journey, and went into the room where Khvostikov and Makarin were sitting. Anatole lay on the sofa in the study, leaning on his elbow and smiling pensively, while his handsome lips muttered tenderly to himself. "Come and eat something. Have a drink." Dólokhov shouted to him from the other room. "I don't want to," answered Anatole, continuing to smile. "Come, Balagá is here." Anatole rose and went into the dining room. Balagá was a famous troika driver who had known Dólokhov and Anatole some 6 years and had given them good service with his troikas. More than once, when Anatole's regiment was stationed at Tver, he had taken him from Tver in the evening, brought him to Moscow by daybreak, and driven him back again the next night. More than once he had enabled Dólokhov to escape when pursued. More than once he had driven them through the town with gypsies and ladykins, as he called the cocottes. More than once in their service he had run over pedestrians and upset vehicles in the streets of Moscow, and had always been protected from the consequences by "my gentlemen," as he called them. He had ruined more than one horse in their service. More than once they had beaten him, and more than once they had made him drunk on champagne and Madeira, which he loved, and he knew more than one thing about each of them which would long ago have sent an ordinary man to Siberia. They often called Balagá into their orgies and made him drink and dance at the gypsies, and more than 1,000 rubles of their money had passed through his hands. In their service he risked his skin and his life 20 times a year, and in their service had lost more horses than the money he had from them would buy. But he liked them. Liked that mad driving at 12 miles an hour, liked upsetting a driver or running down a pedestrian, and flying at full gallop through the Moscow streets. He liked to hear those wild, tipsy shouts behind him, "Get on! Get on!" when it was impossible to go any faster. He liked giving a painful lash on the neck of some peasant who, more dead than alive, was already hurrying out of his way. Real gentlemen, he considered them. Anatole and Dólokhov liked Balagá too, for his masterly driving and because he liked the things they liked. With others Balagá bargained, charging 25 rubles for a 2 hours' drive, and rarely drove himself, generally letting his young man do so. But with his gentlemen he always drove himself and never demanded anything for his work. Only a couple of times a year, when he knew from their wallets that they had money in hand, he would turn up a morning quite sober and with a deep bow would ask them to help him. The gentleman always made him sit down. "Do help me out, Theodore Ivanovitch, sir, or your Excellency," he would say. "I am quite out of horses. Let me have what you can to go to the fair." And Anatole and Dólokhov, when they had money, would give him 1,000 or a couple of thousand rubles. Balagá was a fair-haired, short and snub-nosed peasant of about 27, red-faced with a particularly red thick neck, glittering little eyes and a small beard. He wore a fine dark blue silk-lined cloth coat over a sheepskin. On entering the room now, he crossed himself, turning toward the front corner of the room, and went up to Dólokhov, holding out a small black hand. "Theodore Ivanitch," he said, bowing. "How do you do, friend? Well, here he is." "Good day, your Excellency," he said again, holding out his hand to Anatole, who had just come in. "I say, Balagá," said Anatole, putting his hands on the man's shoulders, "do you care for me or not, eh? Now do me a service. What horses have you come with, eh?" "As your messengers ordered, your special beasts," replied Balaga. "Well, listen, Balaga. Drive all three to death, but get me there in 3 hours, eh?" "When they are dead, what shall I drive?" said Balaga with a wink. "Mind I smash your face in. Don't make jokes," cried Anatole, suddenly rolling his eyes. "Why joke?" said the driver, laughing. "As if I would grudge my gentleman anything. As fast as ever the horses can gallop, so fast we will go." "Ah," said Anatole. "Well, sit down." "Yes, sit down," said Dólokhov. "I'll stand, Theodore Ivanitch." "Sit down, nonsense! Have a drink," said Anatole, and filled a large glass of Madeira for him. The driver's eyes sparkled at the sight of the wine. After refusing it for manners' sake, he drank it and wiped his mouth with a red silk handkerchief he took out of his cap. "And when are we to start, your Excellency?" "Well," Anatole looked at his watch, "we will start at once. Mind, Balaga, you'll get there in time, eh?" "That depends on our luck in starting, else why shouldn't we be there in time?" replied Balaga. "Didn't we get you to Tver in 7 hours? I think you remember that, your Excellency." "Do you know, one Christmas I drove from Tver," said Anatole smilingly at the recollection, and turning to Makarin, who gazed rapturously at him with wide open eyes. "Will you believe it, Makarka? It took one's breath away, the rate we flew. We came across a train of loaded sleighs and drove right over 2 of them, eh?" "Those were horses," Balaga continued the tale. "That time I had harnessed 2 young side horses with the bay in the shafts," he went on, turning to Dólokhov. "Will you believe it, Theodore Ivanitch, those animals flew 40 miles? I couldn't hold them in. My hands grew numb in the sharp frost, so that I threw down the reins. 'Catch hold yourself, your Excellency,' says I, and I just tumbled on the bottom of the sleigh and sprawled there. It wasn't a case of urging them on. There was no holding them in till we reached the place. The devils took us there in 3 hours. Only the near one died of it." End of chapter 16. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace. Book 8, Chapter 17. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Anatole went out of the room and returned a few minutes later wearing a fur coat girt with a silver belt and a sable cap jauntily set on one side and very becoming to his handsome face. Having looked in a mirror and standing before Dólokhov in the same pose he had assumed before it, he lifted a glass of wine. "Well, good-bye, Theodore. Thank you for everything, and farewell," said Anatole. "Well, comrades and friends," he considered for a moment, "of my youth. Farewell," he said, turning to Makarin and the others. Though they were all going with him, Anatole evidently wished to make something touching and solemn out of this address to his comrades. He spoke slowly in a loud voice and, throwing out his chest, slightly swayed one leg. "All take glasses. You too, Balaga. Well, comrades and friends of my youth, we have had our fling, and lived and reveled, eh? And now when shall we meet again? I am going abroad. We have had a good time. Now farewell, lads. To our health! Hooray!" he cried, and, emptying his glass, flung it on the floor. "To your health," said Balaga, who also emptied his glass and wiped his mouth with his handkerchief. Makarin embraced Anatole with tears in his eyes. "Ah, Prince, how sorry I am to part from you." "Let's go, let's go!" cried Anatole. Balaga was about to leave the room. "No, stop," said Anatole. "Shut the door. We have first to sit down. That is the way." They shut the door and all sat down. "Now, quick march, lads," said Anatole, rising. Joseph, his valet, handed him his sabretache and saber, and they all went out into the vestibule. "And where is the fur cloak?" asked Dólokhov. "Hey, Ignatka, go to Matrina Matrévna and ask her for the sable cloak." "I have heard what elopements are like," continued Dólokhov with a wink. "Why, she will rush out more dead than alive, just in the things she is wearing. If you delay at all, there will be tears, and Papa and Mamma, and she's frozen in a minute and must go back. But you wrap the fur cloak round her first thing and carry her to the sleigh." The valet brought a woman's fox-lined cloak. "Fool, I told you the sable one. Hey, Matrina, the sable!" he shouted so that his voice rang far through the rooms. A handsome, slim, and pale-faced gypsy girl with glittering black eyes and curly blue-black hair, wearing a red shawl, ran out with a sable mantle on her arm. "Here, I don't grudge it. Take it," she said, evidently afraid of her master and yet regretful of her cloak. Dólokhov, without answering, took the cloak, threw it over Matrina, and wrapped her up in it. "That is the way," said Dólokhov, "and then so," and he turned the collar up round her head, leaving only a little of the face uncovered. "And then so, do you see?" and he pushed Anatole's head forward to meet the gap left by the collar, through which Matrina's brilliant smile was seen. "Well, good-bye, Matrina," said Anatole, kissing her. "Ah, my revels here are over. Remember me to Steshka. There, good-bye, good-bye, Matrina. Wish me luck." "Well, Prince, may God give you great luck," said Matrina in her gypsy accent. Two troikas were standing before the porch, and two young drivers were holding the horses. Balaga took his seat in the front one, and holding his elbows high, arranged the reins deliberately. Anatole and Dólokhov got in with him. Makarin, Khvostikov, and the valet seated themselves in the other sleigh. "Well, are you ready?" asked Balaga. "Go!" he cried, twisting the reins round his hands, and the troika tore down the Nikitsky Boulevard. "True! Get out of the way! Hi! True!" The shouting of Balaga and of the sturdy young fellow seated on the box was all that could be heard. On the Arbát Square the troika caught against a carriage, something cracked, shouts were heard, and the troika flew along the Arbát Street. After taking a turn along the Podnovinsky Boulevard, Balaga began to rein in, and turning back drew up at the crossing of the old Konyusheny Street. The young fellow on the box jumped down to hold the horses, and Anatole and Dólokhov went along the pavement. When they reached the gate, Dólokhov whistled. The whistle was answered, and the maidservant ran out. "Come into the courtyard or you will be seen. She will come out directly," said she. Dólokhov stayed by the gate. Anatole followed the maid into the courtyard, turned the corner, and ran up into the porch. he was met by Gabriel, Maria Dmitrievna's gigantic footman. "Come to the mistress, please," said the footman in his deep bass, intercepting any retreat. "To what mistress? Who are you?" asked Anatole in a breathless whisper. "Kindly step in. My orders are to bring you in." "Kurágin! Come back!" shouted Dólokhov. "Betrayed! Back!" Dólokhov, after Anatole entered, had remained at the wicket gate and was struggling with the yard porter, who was trying to lock it. With a last desperate effort Dólokhov pushed the porter aside, and when Anatole ran back, seized him by the arm, pulled him through the wicket, and ran back with him to the troika. End of chapter 17. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
War and Peace,
Book 8.
Chapter 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy.
Book 8.
Chapter 18. Marya Dmitrievna, having found Sónya weeping in the corridor, made her confess everything. And intercepting the note to Natásha, she read it, and went into Natásha's room with it in her hand. "You shameless good-for-nothing," she said. "I won't hear a word." Pushing back Natásha, who looked at her with astonished but tearless eyes, she locked her in. And having given orders to the yard porter to admit the persons who would be coming that evening, but not to let them out again, and having told the footman to bring them up to her, she seated herself in the drawing-room to await the abductors. When Gabriel came to inform her that the men who had come had run away again, she rose frowning, and clasping her hands behind her, paced through the rooms a long time, considering what she should do. Toward midnight she went to Natásha's room, fingering the key in her pocket. Sónya was sitting, sobbing, in the corridor. "Marya Dmitrievna, for God's sake, let me into her," she pleaded. But Marya Dmitrievna unlocked the door and went in without giving her an answer. Disgusting, abominable, in my house. Horrid girl, hussy. "I'm only sorry for her father," thought she, trying to restrain her wrath. "Hard as it may be, I'll tell them all to hold their tongues, and will hide it from the count." She entered the room with resolute steps. Natásha, lying on the sofa, her head hidden in her hands, and she did not stir. She was in just the same position in which Marya Dmitrievna had left her. "A nice girl, very nice," said Marya Dmitrievna, "arranging meetings with lovers in my house. It's no use pretending. You listen when I speak to you," and Marya Dmitrievna touched her arm. "Listen when I speak. You've disgraced yourself like the lowest of hussies. I'd treat you differently, but I'm sorry for your father, so I will conceal it." Natásha did not change her position, but her whole body heaved with noiseless, convulsive sobs which choked her. Marya Dmitrievna glanced round at Sónya and seated herself on the sofa beside Natásha. "It's lucky for him that he escaped me, but I'll find him," she said in a rough voice. "Do you hear what I am saying or not?" she added. She put her large hand under Natásha's face and turned it toward her. Both Marya Dmitrievna and Sónya were amazed when they saw how Natásha looked. Her eyes were dry and glistening, her lips compressed, her cheeks sunken. "Let me be! What is it to me? I shall die!" she muttered, wrenching herself from Marya Dmitrievna's hands with a vicious effort and sinking down again into her former position. "Natalie," said Marya Dmitrievna, "I wish for your good. Lie still. Stay like that then. I won't touch you. But listen. I won't tell you how guilty you are. You know that yourself. But when your father comes back tomorrow, what am I to tell him, eh?" Again Natásha's body shook with sobs. "Suppose he finds out? And your brother? And your betrothed?" "I have no betrothed. I have refused him," cried Natásha. "That's all the same," continued Marya Dmitrievna. "If they hear of this, will they let it pass? He, your father, I know him. If he challenges him to a duel, will that be all right, eh?" "Oh, let me be! Why have you interfered at all? Why? Why? Who asked you to?" shouted Natásha, raising herself on the sofa and looking malignantly at Márya Dmítrievna. "But what did you want?" cried Márya Dmítrievna, growing angry again. "Were you kept under lock and key? Who hindered his coming to this house? Why carry you off as if you were some gypsy singing girl? Well, if he had carried you off, do you think they wouldn't have found him? Your father or brother or your betrothed? And he's a scoundrel, a wretch, and that's a fact." "He's better than any of you!" exclaimed Natásha, getting up. "If you hadn't interfered... Oh my God! What is it all? What is it? Sónya, why? Go away!" And she burst into sobs with the despairing vehemence with which people bewail disasters they feel they themselves have occasioned. Márya Dmítrievna was to speak again, but Natásha cried out, "Go away, go away! You all hate and despise me!" and she threw herself back on the sofa. Márya Dmítrievna went on admonishing her for some time, enjoining on her that it must all be kept from her father, and assuring her that nobody would know anything about it if only Natásha herself would undertake to forget it all and not let anyone see that something had happened. Natásha did not reply, nor did she sob any longer, but she grew cold and had a shivering fit. Márya Dmítrievna put a pillow under her head and covered her with 2 quilts, and herself brought her some lime-flower water, but Natásha did not respond to her. "Well, let her sleep," said Márya Dmítrievna as she went out of the room, supposing Natásha to be asleep. But Natásha was not asleep. With pale face and fixed wide-open eyes she looked straight before her. All that night she did not sleep or weep, and did not speak to Sónya, who got up and went to her several times. Next day Count Rostóv returned from his estate near Moscow in time for lunch, as he had promised. He was in very good spirits. The affair with the purchaser was going on satisfactorily, and there was nothing to keep him any longer in Moscow, away from the countess, whom he missed. Márya Dmítrievna met him and told him that Natásha had been very unwell the day before, and that they had sent for the doctor, but that she was better now. Natásha had not left her room that morning. With compressed and parched lips and dry fixed eyes she sat at the window, uneasily watching the people who drove past and hurriedly glancing around at anyone who entered the room. She was evidently expecting news of him and that he would come or would write to her. When the count came to see her she turned anxiously round at the sound of a man's footstep, and then her face resumed its cold and malevolent expression. She did not even get up to greet him. "What is the matter with you, my angel? Are you ill?" asked the count. After a moment's silence Natásha answered, "Yes, ill." In reply to the count's anxious inquiries as to why she was so dejected and whether anything had happened to her betrothed, she assured him that nothing had happened and asked him not to worry. Márya Dmítrievna confirmed Natásha's assurances that nothing had happened. From the pretense of illness, from his daughter's distress, and by the embarrassed faces of Sónya and Márya Dmítrievna, the count saw clearly that something had gone wrong during his absence. But it was so terrible for him to think that anything disgraceful had happened to his beloved daughter, and he so prized his own cheerful tranquillity, that he avoided inquiries and tried to assure himself that nothing particularly had happened, and he was only dissatisfied that her indisposition delayed their return to the country. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19, Book
8
of War and Peace. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Book
8.
Chapter 19. From the day his wife arrived in Moscow, Pierre had been intending to go away somewhere so as not to be near her. Soon after the Rostóvs came to Moscow, the effect Natásha had had on him made him hasten to carry out his intention. He went to Tver to see Joseph Alexeyevitch's widow, who had long since promised to hand over to him some papers of her deceased husband's. When he returned to Moscow, Pierre was handed a letter from Márya Dmítrievna, asking him to come and see her on a matter of great importance relating to Andrew Bolkonsky and his betrothed. Pierre had been avoiding Natásha because it seemed to him that his feeling for her was stronger than a married man should be for his friend's fiancée, yet some fate constantly threw them together. "What can have happened, and what can they want with me?" thought he as he dressed to go to Márya Dmítrievna's. "If only Prince Andrew would hurry up and come and marry her," thought he on his way to the house. On the Tverskoy Boulevard a familiar voice called to him. "Pierre! Been back long?" someone shouted. Pierre raised his head. In a sleigh drawn by two gray trotting horses that were bespattering the dashboard with snow, Anatole and his constant companion Makárin dashed past. Anatole was sitting upright in the classic pose of military dandies, the lower part of his face hidden by his beaver collar and his head slightly bent. His face was fresh and rosy, his white plumed hat tilted to one side disclosed his curl and pomaded hair besprinkled with powdery snow. "Yes, indeed, that's a true sage," thought Pierre. "He sees nothing beyond the pleasure of the moment, nothing troubles him, and so he is always cheerful, satisfied, and serene. What wouldn't I give to be like him?" he thought enviously. In Márya Dmítrievna's anteroom, the footman who helped him off with his fur coat said that the mistress asked him to come to her in her bedroom. When he opened the ballroom door, Pierre saw Natásha sitting at the window with a thin, pale, and spiteful face. She glanced round at him, frowned, and left the room with an expression of cold dignity. "What has happened?" asked Pierre, entering Márya Dmítrievna's room. "Fine doings," answered Dmítrievna. "For 58 years I have lived in this world and never known anything so disgraceful." And having put him on his honor not to repeat anything she told him, Márya Dmítrievna informed him that Natásha had refused Prince Andrew without her parents' knowledge, and that the cause of this was Anatole Kurágin, into whose society Pierre's wife had thrown her, and with whom Natásha had tried to elope during her father's absence, in order to be married secretly. Pierre raised his shoulders and listened open-mouthed to what was told him, scarcely able to believe his own ears. That Prince Andrew's deeply loved, affianced wife, the same Natásha Rostova, who used to be so charming, should give up Bolkonsky for that fool Anatole, who was already secretly married as Pierre knew, and should be so in love with him as to agree to run away with him, was something Pierre could not conceive and could not imagine. He could not reconcile the charming impression he had of Natásha, whom he had known from a child, with this new conception of her baseness, folly, and cruelty. He thought of his wife. "They are all alike," he said to himself, reflecting that he was not the only man unfortunate enough to be tied to a bad woman. But still he pitied Prince Andrew to the point of tears and sympathized with his wounded pride, and the more he pitied his friend the more did he think with contempt and even with disgust of that Natásha who had just passed him in the ballroom with such a look of cold dignity. He did not know that Natásha's soul was overflowing with despair, shame, and humiliation, and that it was not her fault that her face happened to assume an expression of calm dignity and severity. "But how get married?" said Pierre in answer to Márya Dmítrievna. "He could not marry. He is married." "Things get worse from hour to hour," ejaculated Márya Dmítrievna. "A nice youth! What a scoundrel! And she's expecting him since yesterday. She must be told. Then at least she won't go on expecting him." After hearing the details of Anatole's marriage from Pierre and giving vent to her anger against Anatole in words of abuse, Márya Dmítrievna told Pierre why she had sent for him. She was afraid that the count or Bolkonsky, who might arrive at any moment, if they knew of this affair, which she hoped to hide from them, might challenge Anatole to a duel, and she therefore asked Pierre to tell his brother-in-law in her name to leave Moscow and not dare to let her set eyes on him again. Pierre, only now realizing the danger to the old count, Nicholas, and Prince Andrew, promised to do as she wished. Having briefly and exactly explained her wishes to him, she let him go to the drawing-room. "Mind, the count knows nothing. Behave as if you know nothing either," she said. "I will go and tell her it is no use expecting him. "And stay to dinner if you care to," she called after Pierre. Pierre meant the old count, who seemed nervous and upset. That morning Natásha had told him that she had rejected Bolkónski. "Troubles, troubles, my dear fellow," he said to Pierre. "What troubles one has with these girls without their mother! I do so regret having come here. I will be frank with you. Have you heard she has broken off her engagement without consulting anybody? It's true this engagement was never much to my liking. Of course he's an excellent man, but still, with his father's disapproval they wouldn't have been happy, and Natásha won't lack suitors. Still, it has been going on so long, and to take such a step without father's or mother's consent. And now she's ill and God knows what. It's hard, Count, hard to manage daughters in their mother's absence." Pierre saw that the count was much upset and tried to change the subject, but the count returned to his troubles. Sónya entered the room with an agitated face. "Natásha is not quite well. She's in her room and would like to see you. Márya Dmítrievna is with her and she too asks you to come. Yes, you are a great friend of Bolkónski's. No doubt she wants to send him a message," said the count. Oh dear, how happy it all was!" And clutching the spare gray locks on his temples, the count left the room. When Márya Dmítrievna told Natásha that Anatole was married, Natásha did not wish to believe it and insisted on having it confirmed by Pierre himself. Sónya told Pierre this as she led him along the corridor to Natásha's room. Natásha, pale and stern, was sitting beside Márya Dmítrievna, and her eyes, glittering feverishly, met Pierre with a questioning look the moment he entered. She did not smile or nod, but only gazed fixedly at him, and her look asked only one thing: was he a friend or, like the others, an enemy in regard to Anatole? As for Pierre, he evidently did not exist for her. "He knows all about it," said Márya Dmítrievna, pointing to Pierre and addressing Natásha. "Let him tell you whether I have told the truth." Natásha looked from one to the other as a hunted and wounded animal looks at the approaching dogs and sportsmen. "Natalia Ilyinichna," Pierre began, dropping his eyes with a feeling of pity for her and loathing for the thing he had to do. "Whether it is true or not should make no difference to you because... Then it is not true that he's married?" "Yes, it is true." "Has he been married long?" she asked. "On your honor?" Pierre gave his word of honor. "Is he still here?" she asked quickly. "Yes, I have just seen him." She was evidently unable to speak and made a sign with her hands that they should leave her alone. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20.
Book 8.
Of War and Peace. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy.
Book 8.
Chapter 20. Pierre did not stay for dinner, but left the room and went away at once. He drove through the town seeking Anatole Kurágin, at the thought of whom now the blood rushed to his heart and he felt a difficulty in breathing. He was not at the ice hills, nor at the gypsies, nor at Komonio's. Pierre drove to the club. In the club all was going on as usual. The members who were assembling for dinner were sitting about in groups. They greeted Pierre and spoke of the town news. The footman, having greeted him, knowing his habits and his acquaintances, told him that there was a place left for him in the small dining room, and that Prince Michael Zakhárych was in the library, but Paul Timoféevich had not yet arrived. One of Pierre's acquaintances, while they were talking about the weather, asked if he had heard of Kurágin's abduction of Rostova, which was talked of in the town, and was it true? Pierre laughed and said it was nonsense, for he had just come from the Rostóvs. He asked everyone about Anatole. One man told him he had not come yet, and another that he was coming to dinner. Pierre felt it was strange to see this calm, indifferent crowd of people unaware of what was going on in his soul. He paced through the ballroom, waited till everyone had come, and as Anatole had not turned up, did not stay for dinner, but drove home. Anatole, for whom Pierre was looking, dined that day with Dólokhov, consulting him as to how to remedy this unfortunate affair. It seemed to him essential to see Natásha. In the evening he drove to his sister's to discuss with her how to arrange a meeting. When Pierre returned home after vainly hunting all over Moscow, his valet informed him that Prince Anatole was with the countess. The countess's drawing room was full of guests. Pierre, without greeting his wife, whom he had not seen since his return, at that moment she was more repulsive to him than ever, entered the drawing room, and seeing Anatole went up to him. "Ah, Pierre," said the countess, going up to her husband, "you don't know what a plight our Anatole..." She stopped, seeing in the forward thrust of her husband's head, in his glowing eyes and his resolute gait, the terrible indications of that rage and strength which she knew and had herself experienced after his duel with Dólokhov. "Where you are there is vice and evil," said Pierre to his wife. "Anatole, come with me, I must speak to you," he added in French. Anatole glanced round at his sister and rose submissively, ready to follow Pierre. Pierre, taking him by the arm, pulled him towards himself and was leading him from the room. "If you allow yourself in my drawing room..." whispered Hélène, but Pierre did not reply and went out of the room. Anatole followed him with his usual jaunty step, but his face betrayed anxiety. Having entered his study, Pierre closed the door and addressed Anatole without looking at him. "You promised Count Rostóva to marry her and were about to elope with her? Is that so?" "Mon cher," answered Anatole. Their whole conversation was in French. "I don't consider myself bound to answer questions put to me in that tone." Pierre's face, already pale, became distorted by fury. He seized Anatole by the collar of his uniform with his big hand and shook him from side to side till Anatole's face showed a sufficient degree of terror. "When I tell you that I must talk to you..." repeated Pierre. "Come now, this is stupid, what?" said Anatole, fingering a button of his collar that had been wrenched loose with a bit of the cloth. "You're a scoundrel and a blackguard, and I don't know what deprives me from the pleasure of smashing your head with this," said Pierre, expressing himself so artificially because he was talking French. He took a heavy paperweight and lifted it threateningly, but at once put it back in its place. "Did you promise to marry her?" I didn't think of it. I never promised because..." Pierre interrupted him. "Have you any letters of hers? Any letters?" he said, moving towards Anatole. Anatole glanced at him and immediately thrust his hand into his pocket and drew out his pocketbook. Pierre took the letter Anatole handed him and, pushing aside a table that stood in his way, threw himself on the sofa. "I shan't be violent, so don't be afraid," said Pierre, in answer to a frightened gesture of Anatole's. "First, the letters," said he, as if repeating a lesson to himself. "Secondly," he continued after a short pause, again rising and again pacing the room, "tomorrow you must get out of Moscow." "But how can I?" "Thirdly," Pierre continued without listening to him, "you must never breathe a word of what has passed between you and Countess Rostóva. I know I can't prevent your doing so, but if you have a spark of conscience..." Pierre paced the room several times in silence. Anatole sat at a table, frowning and biting his lips. "After all, you must understand that besides your pleasure there is such a thing as other people's happiness and peace, and that you are ruining a whole life for the sake of amusing yourself. Amuse yourself with women like my wife. With them you are within your rights, for they know what you want of them. They are armed against you by the same experience of debauchery. But to promise a maid to marry her, to deceive, to kidnap... Don't you understand that it is as mean as beating an old man or a child?" Pierre paused and looked at Anatole, no longer with an angry but with a questioning look. "I don't know about that, said Anatole, growing more confident as Pierre mastered his wrath. "I don't know that and don't want to," he said, not looking at Pierre and with a slight tremor of his lower jaw. "But you have used such words to me, mean and so on, which as a man of honor I can't allow anyone to use." Pierre gazed at him with amazement, unable to understand what he wanted. "Though it was a tête-à-tête," Anatole continued, "still I can't..." "Is it satisfaction you want?" said Pierre ironically. "You could at least take back your words, what? If you want me to do as you wish, eh?" "I take them back, I take them back," said Pierre, "and I ask you to forgive me." Pierre involuntarily glanced at the loose button. "And if you require money for your journey..." Anatole smiled. The expression of that base and cringing smile, which Pierre knew so well in his wife, revolted him. "Oh, vile and heartless brood!" he exclaimed, and left the room. Next day Anatole left for Petersburg. End of chapter 20.
War and Peace, Book 8, Chapter 21. Reading for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Pierre drove to Maria Dmitrievna's to tell her of the fulfillment of her wish that Kurágin should be banished from Moscow. The whole house was in a state of alarm and commotion. Natasha was very ill, having, as Maria Dmitrievna told him in secret, poisoned herself the night after she had been told that Anatole was married, with some arsenic she had stealthily procured. After swallowing a little, she had been so frightened that she woke Sónya and told her what she had done. The necessary antidotes had been administered in time, and she was now out of danger, though still so weak that it was out of the question to move her to the country, and so the countess had been sent for. Pierre saw the distracted count and Sónya, who had a tear-stained face, but he could not see Natásha. Pierre dined at the club that day and heard on all sides gossip about the attempted abduction of Rostova. He resolutely denied these rumors, assuring everyone that nothing had happened except that his brother-in-law had proposed to her and been refused. It seemed to Pierre that it was his duty to conceal the whole affair and re-establish Natásha's reputation. He was awaiting Prince Andrew's return with dread, and went every day to the old prince's for news of him. Old Prince Bolkónski heard all the rumors current in the town from Mademoiselle Bourienne, and had read the note to Princess Mary in which Natásha had broken off her engagement. He seemed in better spirits than usual and awaited his son with great impatience. Some days after Anatole's departure, Pierre received a note from Prince Andrew informing him of his arrival and asking him to come to see him. As soon as he reached Moscow, Prince Andrew had received from his father Natásha's note to Princess Mary breaking off her engagement. Mademoiselle Bourienne had purloined it from Princess Mary and given it to the old prince. And he heard from him the story of Natásha's elopement with additions. Prince Andrew had arrived in the evening and Pierre came to see him next morning. Pierre expected to find Prince Andrew in almost the same state as Natásha, and was therefore surprised on entering the drawing-room to hear him in the study talking in a loud, animated voice about some intrigue going on in Petersburg. The old prince's voice and another now and then interrupted him. Princess Mary came out to meet Pierre. She sighed, looking toward the door of the room where Prince Andrew was, evidently intending to express her sympathy with his sorrow, but Pierre saw by her face that she was glad both at what had happened and at the way her brother had taken the news of Natásha's faithlessness. "He says he expected it," she remarked. "I know his pride will not let him express his feelings, but still he has taken it better, far better than I expected. Evidently it had to be." "But is it possible that all is really ended?" asked Pierre. Princess Mary looked at him with astonishment. She did not understand how he could ask such a question. Pierre went into the study. Prince Andrew, greatly changed and plainly in better health, but with a fresh horizontal wrinkle between his brows, stood in civilian dress facing his father and Prince Meshchersky, warmly disputing and vigorously gesticulating. The conversation was about Speransky, the news of whose sudden exile and alleged treachery had just reached Moscow. Now he is censured and accused by all who were enthusiastic about him a month ago. Prince Andrew was saying, and by those who were unable to understand his aims. To judge a man who is in disfavor and to throw on him all the blame of other men's mistakes is very easy. But I maintain that if anything good has been accomplished in this reign, it was done by him alone. He paused at the sight of Pierre. His face quivered and immediately assumed a vindictive expression. Posterity will do him justice, he concluded, and at once turned to Pierre. Well, how are you? Still getting stouter? He said with animation, but the new wrinkle on his forehead deepened. Yes, I am well, he said in answer to Pierre's question and smiled. To Pierre that smile said plainly, I am well, but my health is now of no use to anyone. After a few words to Pierre about the awful roads from the Polish frontier, about people he had met in Switzerland who knew Pierre, and about Monsieur de Sales, whom he had brought from abroad to be his son's tutor, Prince Andrew again joined warmly in the conversation about Speransky, which was still going on between the two old men. If there were treason or proofs of secret relations with Napoleon, they would have been made public, he said with warmth and haste. I do not and never did like Speransky personally, but I like justice. Pierre now recognized in his friend a need with which he was only too familiar, to get excited and to have arguments about extraneous matters in order to stifle thoughts that were too oppressive and too intimate. When Prince Meshchersky had left, Prince Andrew took Pierre's arm and asked him into the room that had been assigned him. A bed had been made up there and some open portmanteaus and trunks stood about. Prince Andrew went to one and took out a small casket from which he drew a packet wrapped in paper. He did it all silently and very quickly. He stood up and coughed. His face was gloomy and his lips compressed. Forgive me for troubling you. Pierre saw that Prince Andrew was going to speak of Natasha, and his broad face expressed pity and sympathy. This expression irritated Prince Andrew, and in a determined, ringing, and unpleasant tone he continued. I have received a refusal from Countess Rostova, and have heard reports of your brother-in-law having sought her hand, or something of that kind. Is that true? Both true and untrue, Pierre began, but Prince Andrew interrupted him. Here are her letters and her portrait, said he. He took the packet from the table and handed it to Pierre. Give this to the countess if you see her. She is very ill, said Pierre. Then she is here still, said Prince Andrew. And Prince Kurágin, he added quickly. He left long ago. She has been at death's door. I much regret her illness, said Prince Andrew, and he smiled like his father, coldly, maliciously, and unpleasantly. So, Monsieur Kurágin has not honored Countess Rostova with his hand, said Prince Andrew, and he snorted several times. He could not marry, for he was married already, said Pierre. Prince Andrew laughed disagreeably, again reminding one of his father. And where is your brother-in-law now, if I may ask? He said. He has gone to Peter's, but I don't know, said Pierre. Well, it doesn't matter, said Prince Andrew. Tell Countess Rostova that she was and is perfectly free, and that I wish her all that is good. Pierre took the packet. Prince Andrew, as if trying to remember whether he had something more to say, or waiting to see if Pierre would say anything, looked fixedly at him. "I say, do you remember our discussion in Petersburg?" asked Pierre. "About?" "Yes," returned Prince Andrew hastily. "I said that a fallen woman should be forgiven, but I did not say I could forgive her. I can't." "But can this be compared?" said Pierre. Prince Andrew interrupted him and cried sharply: "Yes, ask her hand again, be magnanimous, and so on. Yes, that would be very noble. But I am unable to follow in that gentleman's footsteps. If you wish to be my friend, never speak to me of that, of all that. Well, goodbye. So you will give her the packet." Pierre left the room and went to the old Prince and Princess Mary. The old man seemed livelier than usual. Princess Mary was the same as always, but beneath her sympathy for her brother, Pierre noticed her satisfaction that the engagement had been broken off. Looking at them, Pierre realized what contempt and animosity they all felt for the Rostóvs, and that it was impossible in their presence even to mention the name of her who could give up Prince Andrew for anyone else. At dinner the talk turned on the war, the approach of which was becoming evident. Prince Andrew talked incessantly, arguing now with his father, now with the Swiss tutor Dessalles, and showing an unnatural animation, the cause of which Pierre so well understood. End of chapter 21. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 8, Chapter 22. Read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. That same evening Pierre went to the Rostóvs to fulfill the commission entrusted to him. Natásha was in bed, the count at the club, and Pierre, after giving the letters to Sónya, went to Maria Dmitrievna, who was interested to know how Prince Andrew had taken the news. 10 minutes later Sónya came to Maria Dmitrievna. "Natásha insists on seeing Count Peter Kirílovich," said she. "But how? Are we to take him up to her? The room there has not been tidied up." "No, she has dressed and gone into the drawing-room," said Sónya. Maria Dmitrievna only shrugged her shoulders. "When will her mother come? She has worried me to death. Now mind, don't tell her everything," said she to Pierre. "One hasn't the heart to scold her. She is so much to be pitied, so much to be pitied." Natásha was standing in the middle of the drawing-room, emaciated, with a pale, set face, but not at all shamefaced as Pierre expected to find her. When he appeared at the door, she grew flurried, evidently undecided whether to go to meet him or to wait till he came up. Pierre hastened to her. He thought she would give him her hand as usual, but she, stepping up to him, stopped, breathing heavily, her arms hanging lifelessly, just in the pose she used to stand in when she went to the middle of the ballroom to sing, but with quite a different expression of face. "Peter Kirílovich," she began rapidly. "Prince Bolkónski was your friend, is your friend," she corrected herself. It seemed to her that everything that had once been must now be different. "He told me once to apply to you." Pierre sniffed as he looked at her, but did not speak. Till then he had reproached her in his heart and tried to despise her. But he now felt so sorry for her that there was no room in his soul for reproach. "He is here now. Tell him to forgive me." She stopped and breathed still more quickly, but did not shed tears. "Yes, I will tell him," answered Pierre, but he did not know what to say. Natásha was evidently dismayed at the thought of what he might think she had meant. "No, I know all is over," she said hurriedly. "No, that can never be. I am only tormented by the wrong I have done him. Tell him only that I beg him to forgive me for everything." She trembled all over and sat down on a chair. A sense of pity he had never before known overflowed Pierre's heart. "I will tell him everything once more," said Pierre. "But I should like to know one thing." "Know what?" Natásha's eyes asked. "I should like to know, did you love?" Pierre did not know how to refer to Anatole and flushed at the thought of him. "Did you love that bad man?" "Don't call him bad," said Natásha. "But I don't know at all." She began to cry, and a still greater sense of pity, tenderness, and love welled up in Pierre. He felt the tears trickle under his spectacles and hoped they would not be noticed. "We won't speak of it any more, my dear," said Pierre, and his gentle, cordial tone suddenly seemed very strange to Natásha. "We won't speak of it, my dear. I will tell him everything. But one thing I beg of you. Consider me your friend, and if you want help, advice, or simply to open your heart to someone, not now, but when your mind is clearer, think of me." He took her hand and kissed it. "I shall be happy if it is in my power." Pierre grew confused. "Don't speak to me like that. I am not worth it!" exclaimed Natásha and turned to leave the room, but Pierre held her hand. He knew he had something more to say to her, but when he said it he was amazed at his own words. "Stop, stop! You have your whole life before you," said he to her. "Before me? No, all is over for me," she replied with shame and self-abasement. "All over?" he repeated. "If I were not myself, but the handsomest, cleverest, and best man in the world, and were free, I would this moment ask on my knees for your hand and your love." For the first time for many days Natásha wept tears of gratitude and tenderness, and glancing at Pierre, she went out of the room. Pierre too, when she had gone, almost ran into the anteroom, restraining tears and tenderness and joy that choked him, and without finding the sleeves of his fur cloak, threw it on and got into his sleigh. "Where to now, Your Excellency?" asked the coachman. Where to? Pierre asked himself. Where can I go now? Surely not to the club or to pay calls. All men seemed so pitiful, so poor, in comparison with this feeling of tenderness and love he experienced, in comparison with that softened, grateful last look she had given him through her tears. "Home," said Pierre, and despite 10 degrees of frost, 22 Fahrenheit, he threw open the bearskin cloak from his broad chest and inhaled the air with joy. It was clear and frosty. Above the dirty, ill-lit streets, above the black roofs, stretched the dark, starry sky. Only looking up at the sky did Pierre cease to feel how sordid and humiliating were all mundane things, compared with the heights to which his soul had just been raised. At the entrance to the Arbor Square, an immense expanse of dark, starry sky presented itself to his eyes. Almost in the center of it, above the Prechistenka Boulevard, surrounded and sprinkled on all sides by stars, but distinguished from them all by its nearness to the earth, its white light and its long uplifted tail, shone the enormous and brilliant comet of 1812, the comet which was said to portend all kinds of woes and the end of the world. In Pierre, however, that comet with its long, luminous tail aroused no feeling of fear. On the contrary, he gazed joyfully, his eyes moist with tears, at this bright comet which, having traveled in its orbit with inconceivable velocity through immeasurable space, seemed suddenly like an arrow piercing the earth to remain fixed in a chosen spot, vigorously holding its tail erect, shining and displaying its white light amid countless other scintillating stars. It seemed to Pierre that this comet fully responded to what was passing in his own softened and uplifted soul, now blossoming into a new life. End of chapter 22. End of War and Peace, Book 8 by Leo Tolstoy. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.